text reads on the spread where Fannie Lou Hamer is pictured. I was with Mississippi political organizer Fannie Lou Hamer when she got sick and tired of being sick and tired and demanded the right to vote. When she breathed song into the struggle, I shook the tambourine. Whenever I read that passage after the publication of the book, the passage gave me goosebumps. I now believe those goosebumps were Fannie Lou Hamer telling me to write her book.
Tonight we have a very, very special treat of a collaboration that is extraordinary between an artist and an author who are going to present us with new information about a woman we admire in America. And so I'm really ecstatic about that. I would like to acquaint you with where you are and what that means to us as we talk about this African American community here on Beacon Hill and those who are in common cause with them. We talk about this rising and this conversation that is about people who are seeking freedom, people who are looking at liberty from 1641 when they create the body of liberties, the Puritans and the Pilgrims are speaking about freedom in a landscape that they have decided to develop in. And as they consider freedom and liberty, they delineate in 1 through 90 in the articles of that body of liberties, their liberties and freedoms and protections of that. Yet in 91 it says there should be no slavery except one is sold into slavery, or one is captured, or one sells himself into slavery. And so it is with that, these tensions that exist between slavery and freedom are abounding. And people are running away, and people are challenging those notions of what freedom really is in this land. And as we get to the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War, we know that Black people are alive and well and considering that tension and doing something about that tension. And we have, as we approach several centuries and get to 1964, we have the rise of a woman who is continuing that conversation, that tension, and protesting against what is not right. And so tonight, I just want to talk about, for very briefly, making freedom where she stands, because Fannie Lou Hamer, who we will be talking about in much depth, stands on the shoulders of women who met in this house. One of them was Maria Stewart, who lived right on Joy Street. And she made the proclamation to women to take up the banner of men, secure your rights and privileges, sue for them, if you will, make a mighty stand. And she did that in 1830. She was proclaiming that women should be about more than just their domestic work, but be about securing their rights and securing the rights of their community, and especially those of the sable race, as she referred to those who were Black. She is not alone when we talk about these women. As we go through the century of the 19th century, we think about women like Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who was a very active woman in this community, born of what we call the Brahmin. She was married to George Ruffin, who became the first African-American judge in Charlestown. But she was a woman in her own right who helped to recruit for the 54th Regiment that was raised here. And her political activities included the formation of the most salient women's club that was of Black women, called the Women's New Era Club, which had its own newspaper. She was a writer, and she edited the New Era magazine. She also coalesced women who would then become very prominent on the scene of advancing women's suffrage. And so it is with Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin that we find other women who are in force and writing and forging their way to pave the way for others who are going to be in the 20th century raising their voices. Among those women who were here in the 19th century and who were in common cause with Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins, who is one of the descendants of the Paul family that actually began the first church here in this building. And Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins is giving rise to a series in that New Era magazine called Famous Women. And when she talks about famous women, she is raising the questions of how are we going to strategize, how are we going to make the way for us to be counted as citizens in America. And Pauline and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin raised the question against many odds of what was the morality and the considered perception of African American women as they raised their voices against what would have been tradition of women being quiet during that era. And so as they write the Famous Women series, they also quote women like Frances Ellen Watkins Hopper, who spoke in the African Meeting House in 1854 and then again in 1864, raising the questions that became so important that all of the newspapers that were existing at the time carried the entire text of her speeches as she considered who was the African American woman and who were the persons who would bring about these national clubs of African American women that included Mary Church Terrell and others, Anna Julia Cooper, who would then carry on this tradition of women raising their voices to gain equality, to gain the vote. And so it is that we are hailing these women today who are about protest. The book cover that you saw in Still We Rise, Race and Conversations, has to do with an organization that was founded by the author of that book, who is Dr. Carole Boston. She was formerly an aerospace engineer for NASA. And she organized a 1,000 women strong quilting organization called Women of Color Quilters. She has authored Textural Rhythms. She has authored Spirits of the Cloth. She has often authored Women Rise. And now this book is one that has raised the banner of 69 women who are counting moments chronologically in the African American experience from 1619 to 2013. It covers subjects like the Civil Rights Movement. It covers instances of slavery. And it begins with some of the most eloquent quilts, like that on your right of Elizabeth Leake, who was a student of Aaron Douglas, who taught her own students and lived in Washington, D.C. And you can see here, as she's raising the question about the Middle Passage, her silhouetted images are extremely strong in bringing forth stories. These narrative quilts carry within them energy that tells the story, that is a non-threatening story as it begins to unveil itself in visual image, and the viewer has to have the conversation at least with themselves. And so as we look at the next one, that is by a woman who's Laura Stanton, who has looked at the wall that was created when this country was founded in New York. And it at the time was called New Amsterdam. It is the area which then becomes Wall Street. And so as she has arranged these figures in this quilt to personify that barrier that became an obstacle that any warring ships that were coming to occupy that territory was created by enslaved people. She is making that statement in this quilt. And so it is quilts like these and that celebrates the Amistad event in 1839. Robert Smalls and his taking of the Planter in South Carolina, a ship that the Confederates had as a vessel, and then turns it over to the Union Army to create a decisive win for the Civil War, who becomes a congressman who serves the Congress for 5 years, elected 5 terms from South Carolina. This one is called Wheeling Freedom. It's one of mine. Instances like A. Philip Randolph and the Pullman Porters illustrated as a story in this quilt, elevating their story and their presence in American history. Another one about Harriet Tubman. Bessie Coleman by Marion Coleman, that tells the story of a woman who is a black aviator, a trailblazer, goes to France to learn to fly, and raises a school in Chicago to teach others. This one is about Rosewood, a black town in Florida that has its challenges during the Civil Rights era. We Just Keep on Coming, which also has an image of Fannie Lou Hamer in it that celebrates the work of Martin Luther King and civil rights movement on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the Memphis sanitation strike. The work of Carolyn Maslomy that shows a map that had to do with Selma and Bloody Sunday. Another one that celebrates also the voice of Fannie Lou Hamer and the rise from Martin Luther King in that conversation with Lyndon Baines Johnson about voting and the people marching at Selma and the advent of our first black president, Obama. Elizabeth Leake is here again featuring her quilt on Obama and America and the slave ship and telling her story in this narrative quilt. And as I'm going through them quickly, you can see them in the book itself. But I think that the book strikes a chord that as a collection and as a collective of people, we have been on this journey. We have been on this journey for pressing for our civil rights, our citizenship. And in a photograph by Ernest Withers that we featured here in Signs of Freedom, we see a woman who is relishing her voter's registration card in Fayette County, Tennessee, who is indicative of that journey that we have been on, that Fannie Lou Hamer then apprises of in her voice for freedom and captured in this book by Carole Boston Weatherford and the illustrations of Ekua Holmes. It is my honor and opportunity to tell you about them and for them to present to us tonight what they have put together as an extraordinary glimpse into the history and memory of the African American experience and yet that of America. So with that, I would like to make some comments about our beautiful presenters tonight. Carole Boston Weatherford, who is now the 2010 North Carolina Award for Literature recipient, is Baltimore born and raised. I believe her mother is here with her tonight, Ms. Boston. And it tells us in her bio that she composed her first poem in first grade and dictated the verse to her mother on the ride home from school. Her father, a high school printing teacher, printed some of her early poems on index cards. So it tells us a lot about her journey with writing. Since her literary debut with Juneteenth Jamboree in 1995, Carole's books, 36 of them and counting, have received many literary honors. One of them, Moses, when Harriet Tubman led her people to freedom. Illustrated by Kadir Nelson, won the Caldecott Honor, the Coretta Scott King Award for Illustration, and an NAACP Image Award. Becoming Billie Holiday and Before John Was a Jazz Giant won Coretta Scott King honors. Birmingham, 1963, won the Lee Bennett Hopkins Poetry Award, the Jane Addams Children's Literature Honor, and the Jefferson Cup from Virginia Library Association. The Sound That Jazz Makes won the Carter G. Woodson Award from the National Council for the Social Studies and an NAACP Image Award nomination. Freedom on the Menu, the Greensboro Sit-Ins, and Remember the Bridge, Poems of a People, both won the North Carolina Juvenile Literature Award. Dear Mr. Rosenwald and Before John Was a Jazz Giant received Golden Kite honors from the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. In 2007, Carole received the Reagan Rubin Award from the North Carolina English Teachers Association. In 2010, she received the North Carolina Award for Literature, the state's highest civilian honor. Carole earned her Master's of Arts in Publications Design from the University of Baltimore and a Master's of Fine Arts from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She teaches currently at Fayetteville State University and lives in High Point, North Carolina. So we are in for a treat tonight with Carole Boston Weatherford. Before I bring her up, I want to tell you about Ekua Holmes, who is, she's local here, but she's not just local. She's our own artist here in Boston, born and raised here, and I am very proud to have known her for about the 20 years that I've been here as not only an artist, but a true human being, and very fine one at that. And so I'd like to tell you something about Ekua. She's a painter and a collage artist who uses news clippings, photographs, vibrant color, and skillful composition to infuse her work with energy. She layered abstract creations, conveyed a sense of unity, and evoked memories in her work that are both personal and universal. In her ongoing series of collages, she revisits the joys and challenges of childhood through adult eyes. Her works examine the foundational relationships, games, and rules that we learn at an early age and apply throughout our lives. Ekua says, during my childhood, I was nurtured by a loving and supportive community of men and women who played important roles in my life. In everything I create, I hear them saying, "Remember me." Through my work, I honor their legacies by bringing them forward to life with torn and cut shapes of color and texture. With these scraps and remnants, assembled like a down-home quilt, I rebuild my world, putting in only what speaks to my personal and cultural narrative. One of the marked events of Ekua's career as an artist, as she has been director of the Spark Arts mobile unit under Mass Art, is that she was contacted by Google to do a doodle. How many of you know about the doodle that appears? Well, Ekua said she didn't quite know what they were even referring to. But they tapped into her and asked her for Martin Luther King Day to do a Google. And I don't know about you, but I'm very proud of that because there are so many artists who could have been asked to do that, but it's our own Ekua that got asked. And so her work appeared on Google's US homepage. And we are very happy about that. So I look forward to what the collaboration of Carole and Ekua will bring us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lamerchi, for that beautiful introduction. And before I start, I just want to pick up on one thing that Lamerchi said about Ekua, and that is that when she creates her work, she hears her ancestors saying, "Remember me." Well, about 20 years ago, I was working on a book, well, really probably 25 years ago, I was working on a book that was the book that I spent the most time on. It took 20 years from the time that I conceived the idea in graduate school to the time that it was published. Had a publisher that went out of business, and I had to get another publisher, but it had a different title with the publisher who went out of business than it had when it went into print. The title of it was, at that time, "Remember Me." The eventual title was "Remember the Bridge," but I think we still, it still resonates. It's still the same thing, so I just wanted to bring that forward. As some of you may know, those of you who have followed my work in one way or another, Voice of Freedom was not my first book about the African American struggle. I have written about Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad, the sit-in movement, and the 1963 bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Nor was Voice of Freedom the first time that I lifted up Fannie Lou Hamer. She first appeared in my picture book, The Beatitudes from Slavery to Civil Rights. And there was really just one passage in that book. The text in that book is a poem that's narrated in the voice of God. And the text reads, on the spread where Fannie Lou Hamer is pictured, "I was with Mississippi political organizer Fannie Lou Hamer when she got sick and tired of being sick and tired and demanded the right to vote. When she breathed song into the struggle, I shook the tambourine." Whenever I read that passage after the publication of the book, the passage gave me goosebumps. I now believe those goosebumps were Fannie Lou Hamer telling me to write her book. And eventually, of course, I did. Thus, the seed of one book came from another. When I wrote the manuscript for Voice of Freedom, the biggest challenge was finding Fannie Lou's voice. I deliberately did not study Mississippi dialect, listen to her spoken voice, or even read transcripts of her speeches. I wanted to see how her voice would come to and through me. So I searched for Fannie Lou. I found her in the field. I found her on the front porch. I found her at the microphone a lot. I found her at rallies and protests on the front line of the freedom struggle. I found her in a Mississippi jail, beaten black and blue. I found her on Capitol Hill, taking care of business. I found her in mid-song. I found her at the Democratic National Convention and on the campaign trail. And I found her in her glory. Fannie Lou Hamer was undereducated, but extremely eloquent, known as much for stirring speeches as for rousing songs. After writing the first draft of Voice of Freedom, I finally viewed videos of her and listened to recordings of her speeches. And somehow I had nailed her speech patterns without ever having listened to or seen a word of her speaking. The youngest of 20 children, Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper's daughter and then a sharecropper's wife. She dragged her first bag of cotton at age 6. She was involuntarily sterilized, mobilized by a voter registration campaign, and hunted by white supremacists. She worked for political equality and to uplift the poor. She took her cause to Capitol Hill, traveled to Africa, and cast her first vote for herself. She possessed rare courage. As she put it, "I guess if I'd had any sense, I'd have been a little scared. But what was the point of being scared? The only thing they could do to me was kill me, and it seemed they'd been trying to do that a little bit at a time ever since I could remember." When I began writing this poetic biography, I did not expect young readers to know Fannie's name. What still surprises me, though, is how many adults have never heard of her. As a writer, I mine the past for family stories, fading traditions, and forgotten struggles. Countless women worked in the trenches during the Civil Rights Movement. With the exception of Rosa Parks, however, these women warriors are largely forgotten. Voice of Freedom is my way of honoring Fannie Lou Hamer, whose deeds and sacrifices still inspire and empower. Fannie Lou Hamer said, "The truest thing we have in this country at this time is children. If they think you've made a mistake, kids speak out." Her observation still rings true. When children read my stories or poems about slavery or segregation, they ask tough questions like, "Who made those stupid rules?" Kids have a strong sense of justice. Children are our conscience and beacons of hope for humanity. They will keep us honest. First and foremost, Fannie Lou Hamer was a humanitarian. She believed, "Ain't no such thing as I can hate anybody and hope to see God's face. We serve God by serving our fellow man." I'd like to read to you the poem that is probably the climax of the biography. And I say it's the climax because at this point in her civil rights movement career, she could very well have stopped, but she pressed on. So the poem is called "The Beating." In June 1963, I went to citizenship school in South Carolina. On the way back, the bus had stopped in Columbus, Mississippi. Me and the other trainees was hungry and decided to eat in the terminal. We ordered breakfast at the whites-only lunch counter, knowing segregation been outlawed. After a long wait, we was finally served. But the bus driver called the police, and down the road in Winona, we got kicked off the bus and thrown in jail. When I asked what was the charges, the police told me to shut up. They put us in separate cells and made other prisoners beat us, black and blue. They just kept beating me, the jailers telling me, "You nigger bitch, we're gonna make you wish you were dead." Through the pain, I quoted scripture. One prisoner beat me till we were both exhausted. Then the other took over. I waited 3 days for a doctor to show up. SNCC sent someone to bail us out, but the police locked him up and beat him too. It took Andrew Young from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to get us released. The same day, NAACP leader Medgar Evers was slain in his driveway for teaching black people their rights. The others said it was my singing what brought them through. That November, John F. Kennedy was killed, and Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president. He promised Dr. King to finish what Kennedy couldn't. In July 1964, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill into law. The blood of freedom fighters was in his pen. And so now I'm going to turn the podium over to Ekua whose art just radiates with the spirit of Fannie Lou Hamer. Thank you.
In addition to thanking you for coming out tonight to spend this time with us, I just want to say what an honor it is to stand on this stage. When we talk about legacy and ancestors, I think about the people who have stood here to share ideas, and it gives me chills to know that I might be standing in this spot. I do think a lot about my ancestors and remembering them and bringing them forward to life. I have a little granddaughter, and I think about how my art will speak to her and her generation and her children when I decide what I'm going to work on. But when it comes to this particular project, I have to say, I just lucked out. I mean, my first ever illustrated story, I worked on a manuscript from a celebrated and seasoned author with a highly regarded and visionary publishing company on a story about an incredible Black woman of power and influence. What's not to love about that? I've always loved children's books, and in the back of my mind held it as a possible path for my work. At exhibitions, people would say, "Have you ever thought about doing children's books?" Well, yes, I had thought about it. I believe children's books introduced me to the world of art through the illustrations. Long before I went to museums and galleries, I went to the library with my Aunt Barbara and cousins Patricia and Jay every week. Down Walnut Avenue to Seaver Street, and then down to the Eggleston branch of the Boston Public Library. And we would come away with our stacks of slim books, almost as tall as we were. We would devour them at home and beg to go back for more, but we'd have to wait another week. In more recent times, Ann Moore called to say that her company, Candlewick Press, had a manuscript for me to consider. A manuscript about Fannie Lou Hamer. Who, me? Really? I knew about her role in Freedom Summer and her signature statement, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," but not a lot more. And I was thrilled to be asked to illustrate her story. This was my first time illustrating a book, and I found that research and patience were crucial. I saturated myself first in Carole's words, her beautiful poems, and I sketched and revised, each time hoping to get closer to what I felt would be the right composition. There was a lot of thinking and looking and moving things around. I read the manuscript again and again and other books about Fannie Lou Hamer, and slowly colors and compositions took shape, patterns and contours and facial expressions. As you can see from the photographs, Fannie Lou Hamer is a woman of many faces and many emotions. Looking online, I was able to find images of her from the 60s, but there were very few early photos. Her family was probably too poor for that. So for the early years, I had to imagine her as a child. What did she look like? How did she wear her hair? What was her demeanor? Where did she live? Because it seemed to me that something of who she became would be evident in her, even as a child. I read books and articles, comments written by people who had worked with her in the movement, listened to tapes of her speaking and singing, looked at photos of her hometown, and I immersed myself. The poems in the manuscript were so visually rich that I had a lot to work with. To create these illustrations, I used my collage technique, which is cutting and pasting, torn paper, lace, wallpaper, those kinds of things. All of my work is made of cut and torn paper and includes many different items. I scour flea markets and thrift stores, picking up things that speak to me and that will enhance the work. Oops, wait. Just as I was about to develop the illustration for the page where Fannie Lou Hamer's mother buys her a doll, I ran across these two old homemade dolls at a thrift store in Salem, Massachusetts. And they seemed to be just the kind of doll that Fannie Lou Hamer's mother would have given her. They were homemade and they were very authentic. And it was as if the universe was telling me, you're on the right path, and giving me just what I needed to do this next spread. One of the things that inspires me most about the story of Fannie Lou Hamer is that she began her voting rights work at such a mature age. She was already a very hard worker, devoted mother and daughter, committed wife, and staunch believer in the Word of God. Then in her 40s, she takes on the system, sacrifices everything to be a part of making meaningful change. And she knew this battle was bigger than just her, bigger than any one human being, but she did her part, and from the humblest beginnings. She never said, I'm too old, too tired, too poor, too uneducated. This underscored for me that no matter where we are in life, we can do something to make positive change in the world. Many people ask me what it was like to work with Carole, but it's funny, there's not as much communication between author and illustrator as you might think. Generally, the publisher selects the illustrator, so I feel very fortunate to have been working on this book by Carole Boston Weatherford, who's written over 36 books, probably more than that, and won so many awards. This is one of my favorite pieces from the story. It's Fannie Lou Hamer and her 19 brothers and sisters, who went out into the cotton fields every day. And as Carole mentioned, she was 6 years old when she picked her first bag of cotton. Now I've got a little granddaughter who's 8 years old. And as I was creating this piece, I was imagining my granddaughter having to go out into the world every day and pick hundreds of pounds of cotton at 6. So anything that we can do to make the world a different place where that is not a possibility, I want to be a part of that. And my voice comes through in my artwork. We all have a role to play, and I'm just glad that illustrating this book has been a part of mine. Thank you.
Give props to my mother. She had the vision to, first of all, park the car after I recited a poem to her and to ask me to say it again. And she wrote it down. Then a year or so later, when it turned out to not be a fluke and I had composed some other poems, she asked my dad, and he was a high school printing teacher, if he would print some of my early poems on what amounted to index cards on the printing press in his classroom. So she had a lot of vision, and it was in the 60s, and it was not at a time when it was in our culture to pursue a creative career. But she always encouraged me and put me in class after class, whatever interest I had, whether it was art, photography, or sewing. She exposed me to whatever I was interested in, and I thank her for that. Famous figure too, though. And she's not a famous figure. She should be, but she's famous in my heart. But the famous figure that inspires me is Billie Holiday, the jazz singer. She's my muse, and I've written about her before.
So the story about Fannie Lou Hamer and the doll was one of the stories that really stuck out to me because she said to her mother, why aren't we white? We work so hard and we go to bed hungry, and white people have all the food and they have heat in their homes, and her mother said, black is beautiful. And she went and got her a doll, a black doll. And I felt like it's so important, the influence of mothers in the lives of their children. My mother was also a champion for me. In the 3rd grade, a teacher told her to watch me in the arts, and she started taking me to the museum and trying to make a way for me. I'm sure it was something extra to do, an extra expense that we probably couldn't afford, but she made a way for me. And then the other thing that I want to say is there were a constellation of women in my neighborhood, Alma Lewis being one that I constantly talk about because she instilled some of her Garvey values in me, that there was nothing that I couldn't do, that I was an exceptional human being, and she instilled that in all of her dance students. And so I carry her spirit in me all the time.
I'd like to say that it's my mother that has been the most gracious influence on my life. She was an artist in her own right, and she was reared by my grandfather, who was a tailor. And sewing became one of her talents, along with other crafts. And as I was growing up, I grew up in Florida, and she was from Virginia, so every summer we traveled from Florida to Virginia. And during those trips, there was placed in my hand a crochet hook, or a pair of knitting needles, and a map. I was her co-pilot, for getting there, but I also had to be industrious while I was riding. And so it is that she was my greatest influence and continues to be my #1 fan at 100. And so I'm really blessed in that. And my most famous influence has now become a muse for me, who is Frances L. Watkins Harper, who had an extraordinary talent, and we are here with William Arthur, and I think of her in the footsteps of one like Frances L. Watkins Harper, who sold 50,000 copies of her books in a time when publishing was not easy, printing was not easy, and the availability and access to books was not easy. And so against those odds, she posed her career as one that would be disseminating information. And she truly lived by that and lived a long life from 1825 to 1912. During that time, she was one of our precursors to Rosa Parks in that she waged protest in Philadelphia for the integration of horse-drawn streetcars and did a sit-in with another woman. And so it is that she is my hero.
You have a couple questions for one another.
Well, Ekua, I'd like to know, since this is your first book, was your first book, and she's working on others now, she's probably very busy. How did it feel when you first saw the book or the effigies with the Islamics folded and gathered copies, but they're not down together, that married the artwork and the text? How did you feel the first time you saw them together?
Well, I felt wonderful when I delivered that artwork to Candlewick, the entire book, because it was a labor with a capital L a lot of times, trying to honor your poems, trying to honor Fannie Lou Hamer. I was up lots of late nights wondering if I had it right. And so I think I remember that feeling absolutely. To see the book in print was just a magical thing. And it has been since then. The other authors and illustrators who I've long admired, Carole and I were in Philadelphia at an African American Children's Book Festival, and there were people there whose books are on my shelf that I read to my child, and so it's a dream come true. Thank you for asking.
During your collaboration and the moments that you did get to talk to each other, what were your conversations like?
This answer is going to surprise you. You just heard Ekua talk about Philadelphia. At that point, the book came out in August, and Philadelphia was just this past February, and that was the first time we had ever met. The first time we ever talked was maybe about a month or so ahead of time when we were talking about what's going to happen in Philly, what's it like in Philly. She was new on the children's literature scene, and she wanted to know what the event was like. So there was no back and forth when the illustrations were being created, and that's intentional on the part of the publisher. The publishers, the editor and the art director don't want the author messing with the illustrator. They're the go-between. They serve as the go-between. So yeah, a lot of people think that the author and the illustrator sit at the table together. And I said, oh, I like that yellow, but go with a little more green. No, but I'm glad it looks like it did.
Yes. So my question for you, Carole, is you said you mine history for these untold stories. Can you tell us 3 things that you look for in a story? We've talked about other Black women, but you've chosen certain ones. What are the 3 things that you look for?
Well, the first thing is that the story has to speak to me.
if I can't relate to it and connect with it, I'm not going to be able to write about it. So I have to have, you know, kind of an intense interest in the subject matter. So it's got to speak to me. I also look for people who have been perhaps overlooked. They're, you know, unsung heroes or heroines, or slipping into, almost slipping into obscurity. So I look for those kind of people that I think deserve to be more widely known. And then from a marketing perspective, I try to look for subjects that have not been written about over and over and over again, or subjects that I can write about in a very different way than what they were approached before. So, you know, for example, although I have a book about Harriet Tubman, and she had been written about many, many times before, I wrote about her first escape and the soul searching that she had to do to decide to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And I did it through a poetic text that was written in 3 voices, a series of conversations that Harriet Tubman believed that she had with God. So the 3 voices are God's voice, Harriet's voice, and the narrator's voice. So I had to be able to do something different and creative with the life that I'm writing about. Archie, I have to ask you a question. Tell us some of the other women that you have incorporated into your quilts. You showed us Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Who are some of the others?
Fannie Lou Hamer. Other women that I have become somewhat my heroines, if you would call them that, would be Sarah Parker Ramon, who was a member of the family of Ramones from Salem that started in the 1700s in Salem, with John Ramon, her father, being sent from Curacao by his mother with a note in a bottle on a ship, sent to Salem, Massachusetts, as a boy about 7 years old, and asking the shipmates to take care of him. And her abiding fate, I would love to have known what she looked like, but I imagine her, and she becomes a woman who is so dedicated to her son being better than what she saw as a life for him in Curacao, that she takes that risk. So she becomes a highlight to me, and he is extraordinary as he grows up as a servant in Salem and begins to nurture the talents of catering and owning a food store. He raises children who are proficient in literature and in speaking, and he is dedicated, he and his wife are dedicated to them becoming highly educated. And so following the Ramon family and their advancement, we have come to what the Museum of African American History has collected as the stories of Black entrepreneurs. And his family is indicative of that sojourn of entrepreneurs who are battling the odds as Black people. And I found that John Ramon and his family, his wife and his children, served the 200th anniversary of Salem being celebrated. They have a catering business. They have a restaurant. They have a hair, dressing, and pomade line of beauty products that they advertise. This is in the early 1800s. It's a strong story. And Charles Lennox Ramon, is one of the people who meets in the Saturday Meeting House, who is one of their children. He is an anti-slavery advocate, and he travels to England to the anti-slavery conventions there. As he begins to understand more what the role is, he also shares that with his sister, Sarah Parker. She also takes a journey to England to speak and be an orator for the anti-slavery society there. While she's there, she decides she wants to be more educated. She attends school in England, and then she goes to Italy. While in Italy, she becomes a medical doctor. I am astounded that she many scholars and advanced persons in literature who has written about her and has then led a campaign to have her and then Monique Lewis, who also is an artist who expatriated to Italy, to have their names raised in Florence and unearth them as powerful women. So,
now it's your turn. I'm sure someone here is itching to ask a question. Who's first?
Thank you all so much. Like a lot of people, I think I saw Fannie Lou Hamer in life, through Eyes on the Prize, the PBS television documentary show. Very powerful footage, but of course you don't get a sense of the whole arc of her life. I just wanted to ask if any of you, if you're familiar with that segment of Eyes on the Prize, and if you have any comment on it.
I am familiar with it, but I saw it so long ago. And quite frankly, that was not one of the videos that I watched when I had the book, but I don't even have that in my possession anymore. But that may have been when I was being exposed to her as well. Because I really can't put my finger on my first recollection of her that went beyond the I've been sick and tired, and I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. That's that's her signature phrase.
well, Eyes on the Prize is one of the preeminent video series, film series that was done by Henry Hampton, who was one of the major players here, who was actually helped this museum to become and advance in this community. And so we have shown Eyes on the Prize to teachers in our Teachers Institute, and it is then that I very recently realized that Fannie Lou Hamer was in it. I've seen it as a teenager, but did not understand it. It was so prolific in its coverage. But seeing her in that Democratic National Convention, I was struck by her courage. And I don't know if Bernice Reagan was singing during that portion of it, but whenever I see her or hear her name, I hear the song, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. And so I think Henry Hampton, in creating that series, Eyes on the Prize, has left an indelible mark that is probably in our subconscious, those of us who've seen it, because it was so extraordinarily, I call it kind of almost invasive in its impact on our consciousness and our awareness of what really happened during the Civil Rights era. So that's where I can say that I saw her, and she became really a part of our vocabulary.
I was quite interested in the fact of the illustration and the quilts and, of course, the literary part of the program. They're all different medias, but yet you come across when you bring out the various points of interest that perhaps with some individuals they have to rethink their thinking process in order to understand more deeply the African-American experience. But it's interesting with the illustrations and with the quilts. Do you find that you're able to express certain themes that perhaps are a little bit more sensitive in the literary part of doing it? Or I'm thinking like, for instance, you have a person or a puppet, and they can bring out certain things to the puppet that if I or somebody else had said may be more offensive to it. But do you find that by bringing it out illustratively or through your quilts that you're able to bring these things up more to more of a visual part of it so that they can really understand the full depth of what's being brought up?
Thank you for that question. I certainly aspire to do that, to complement the text and to bring out things in the illustration that the text may not have said specifically, but are implied, and to illuminate parts of the story within the illustration. I've been talking to my cousin Phyllis, who came up from Georgia, and my partner Clennon about the illustration of the beating of Fannie Lou Hamer, and they feel that that's one of the strongest illustrations. It's not an illustration that was fun to do because I'm portraying someone who didn't deserve that fate, but it's part of the story that we need to know, we need to be sensitive to. And so I think I tried to complement the text, but also show that Fannie Lou Hamer had a divine protection, and I use color and shapes to do those kinds of things. So I hope that as an illustrator, that would be a hallmark to be able to bring something unique to the story that complements the text.
Since I'm not going to leave it out, because I'm not a visual artist, but I do want to say that illustrations are a very important part of children's books. And I think illustrations are very important in our society. Pictures are important because we're, as human beings, we're visual creatures. That's the sense that we rely on the most. So, to just read some words, yes, you can get it, but the story, the narrative gains power when it can be illustrated, whether it's with art or with documentary photographs. So I always like to have. I don't want to do books that don't have pictures because I think pictures are important. They have power.
I agree. The visual has power. That is, it speaks, as we've heard, the adage 1,000 words, the picture. I feel extraordinarily privileged to have been invited to write the foreword to And Still We Rise. And doing that, I had to look at the extraordinary work of the quilters, the 69 quilts there, and their mediums, and consider what the artists had described as their journey in creating that quilt. And what I found commonality and thread was that there was a commitment to tell the story and to tell the truth. And so with that, the opportunity for artists to depict what are sometimes tough stuff, to have a conversation about. And there's a consideration that you can put it there, and then those who see it wrestle with it in their mind in ways that they might not ordinarily. And so the adventure that an artist goes through, and at least I can speak for myself, as I look at these powerful moments of history, is to try and consider for the people who are in it that they had a location, they had an address, they had a store, they had a community. They were not, as we have been rendered, especially in African American history, people we've been told almost are non-human, don't have a place, don't have a name. It's not true. So the opportunity to visually depict that people are active and doing things that they challenge American history and its visuals is a great honor. So, to accompany the literature that we see, the visual is so important. I teach students in a course called Visual Thinking. And to get them to consider the landscapes that they see, to consider the people and places and events that they see in pictures or in artworks, and the kinds of things that we ask questions of them with in this course has been revelatory in terms of human interaction and human rights and other things that they had not considered if they hadn't been really looking closely. And that often we find that the pose is intentional to bring a certain impact on the viewer. The Museum of African American History is going to present an exhibit on Frederick Douglass, the most photographed man in the 19th century, based on a book by John Stilliford's Tribe that is coming. And it is so obvious that Frederick Douglass was posing intentionally to have an effect, to raise and give a sense of evolution of African American presence. So that would answer.
That exhibit is opening in June.
I just have a couple of comments, not questions. I grew up in South Australia, Albany, Georgia, and I grew up as an activist, youth activist in the civil rights movement. I had the great fortune of meeting Fannie Lou Hamer and spending some time, a little time with her. And I am chomping at the bits to get downstairs and purchase some of those books because I'm pretty sure that they were told the power, the spirit of this woman, extraordinary woman, and Laura Chi, and still have eyes. I purchased that several months ago, and I think you did a brilliant and elegant forward to pull together the narrative of all of those incredible quilts. And I often say, using Yoruba proverb verb, until the lion tells his, and I say her own story, then the story of the lion and lions will always glorify the hunter. And I thank all three of you for telling our story.
There's just one story that's important to tell following Mimi's words. How many of you have seen the photograph with the people in the pool that the acid was thrown into? Mimi was one of the people in the pool. Okay, so have a chance to meet her at the end of this program as well. We're going to have a reception in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to take one or two more questions, and then we'll have a chance to convene downstairs, enjoy some libations, and the presence of these gifted writers and artists, as well as all other things. I think you were next.
I want to talk about the genesis of the art. So I know that that's the way children's illustrated books come together, but I read in the book that some of the illustrations were based on photos. And I was really happy, by the way, to see the photo of the three women in front of the Capitol building. So I was like, hey, there it is. So I assumed there was a lot of collaboration in terms of, because the photos are historic, that I thought might come from Carole. So how did you, or perhaps the book publisher, decide on using actual photographs as a basis for some of the illustrations?
So my process is to do a lot of research, a lot of reading, a lot of looking at images, and trying to understand the character and all of her many facets. And that was captured visually by photographers before I got to this story. I wanted it to look like Fannie Lou Hamer. There is another book about her, a children's book that was done in the 60s, but they used sort of a generic woman, and I wanted these illustrations to look like Fannie Lou Hamer. And there were many photographers who covered the civil rights movement and the voting rights, the Freedom Summer, and they had very eloquent photographs. My job was to reinterpret those photographs into collage illustrations. And I had many conversations with some of the photographers. Some of them were really happy to see their work being brought back out from the 1960s and to see Fannie Lou Hamer her life being illuminated through this book. So they were very helpful. When you're doing a historical document, you want to be as accurate as possible, but at the same time imaginative and creative with it. And so that's why I chose the photographs that I chose. There were many, and I selected certain ones. And I hope that my work has added an element to them.
I also salute you for having a bibliography suggested reading for the reading.
Just want to say the timelines in Carole's books, and I'm sure you've done that more than once, is really, really helpful because I was a child in 1964, and you grow up kind of thinking something about the movement, but then when you get into a project like this, you realize that you don't know as much as you think you know, and you certainly don't know all the dimensions of the human beings that are kind of the faces of the civil rights movement. So for me, the opportunity to do this book has really changed my direction. And in addition to civil rights, I've also been looking more into my own southern roots. My father's people were from Arkansas, just one state over from Mississippi. And he was there at the same time that Fannie Lou Hamer was alive. And so I imagine he and his family went through some of the same kinds of injustices. I like to say I'm a Roxbury girl from Boston, but my roots are Southern. So this book has helped me to reconnect with that.
Okay, we'll take one last question.
All right, Florida, our friend from Rock Hill Community College.
Thank you all for this evening's discussion and illuminating and for us in this way. It's a really simple question. We're dressed in our gallery and curating images all the time. How did that publisher find you?
Can you walk me? Okay. So they found me the same way that the folks from Google said they found me. We found you on the internet. And my response was, that's like saying you found me in the Himalayas. The internet is vast and populated with hundreds of artists and photographers. And so, I do believe in destiny. And I like to feel like the investment that my Aunt Barbara made in me, taking me to the library every week and cultivating me as a reader and thinker and visual person has come full circle. And I was just waiting for it to happen.
This generation will only know what the civil rights movement meant and why it remains relevant if we tell the stories and tell those stories in ways that relate to a new reality. It is important that we take the time to remember and recall the stories that may be familiar to people of a certain age, but that are foreign to a new generation.